with the discussion of infrastructure and community development. So without further ado, Israel now has the floor to lead the session. Israel, you have the floor. Thank you, Nancy. Um, could you please give me hosting privileges so I can share my video and my screen? And having said that, it is a joy to be here with all of you. Thank you, Nancy, for giving me privileges. I also want to tell you that Dan York is here with us today. He is our overall coordinator, and he led the project last year in 2020. He has been teaching these fundamental sessions in English and in French throughout the day. So he is here to work with us. We can answer questions in Spanish, but Dan can also help us because he's an expert in this area. So as I was telling you, it's a joy to be here. I set up my coffee here that you can see. So I feel right at home. I also want to thank our interpreter, Son Limit, who is joining us here today. Thanks to her work, we can reach people who speak English. So let us get started to talk about how we can work towards having safer web servers by using the Open Standards Everywhere project we launched in 2020. First of all, the training objective for today is to improve the availability and the security of your web servers by using open internet standards. This is relevant in the context of our work as an organization, in the context of your work as members of our chapters as well, because we work towards having an internet that is open, globally connected, reliable, and secure for everyone. So with this project, we are trying to cover security and the openness of the internet. So what we want is to improve your web server score in internet.nl. And I will tell you a bit more about it later on. I also want to remind you that if you want to ask any questions or make comments, you can do that using the chat box or the Q&A box as well. We can answer your questions and your comments. And then it's something that we really want to get. We like getting questions from you. So if you have any doubts throughout the session, you can ask them. Feel free to do that. And if you have any questions so far, do tell us. Don't wait up until the end, just write them down and we'll be answering them at the end of the session. So what happened with the Open Standards Everywhere project, which was one of our 2020 Action Plan project. This was the OSE project. And this particular project, and thanks to the actions of these projects, what we want is for open standards to be everywhere. And that, of course, includes our own websites and our own services. Because as I was telling you, we want to work based on these characteristics for the internet. We want it to be open based on agreed upon voluntary standards that anyone can use to connect with other systems. We want it to be globally connected. That means that it can be connected through IPv6 connections, which are native connections for new networks, especially those that are mobile, or through HTTP2 for faster connections. And in the case of internet that is secure and trustworthy, you can work with DNSSEC or TLS 1.3, HTTPS, and more. And in order to do that, what we want is we create a test framework. So before going into the activities of the projects per se, we do need to have a test framework. That is, we want to know from where we're starting and where we're headed. And in order to do that, you can access internet.nl, which I mentioned earlier. If you go to that website, the website mentions your adoption of IPv6, DNSSEC, HTTPS, TLS, and that includes HSTS, among other technologies. This work has been developed by NL Net Labs with the support of many organizations, including Internet Society, and Dan has shared the link over there in the chat. Thank you for that, Dan. And you can also find other elements of the test frameworks in http2.pro. So by going into these websites, and this is something that you can do yourselves right now if you want, just write down the address of your website and see the score that you get. So that would be the starting point, right, for us to have our test framework and see what we need to improve upon. Now, it is important for us to bear into mind that anything that is marked as part of this project and a part of these activities is only focused on the security and the standards of the connections to a web server. We're not going to be focused on the content of the websites per se. We won't look at their presentation or design or about the content management systems. We won't look at accessibility. We won't look at mobile usability, and we won't look at page speed performance. Now, that doesn't mean that these attributes or these characteristics are less important or not important. On the contrary, we do know that they matter, but at this stage, these activities are solely focused on the connections to a web server. We know that there are other organizations and we know that there are other initiatives that focus on those elements that are out of the scope of this particular project, and we can gladly point you in the right direction of those resources and organizations. But at this stage, we need to know what the scope of this particular project web servers. Now, the project goals for 2020 of the OSE was to build and deploy reference servers to show what a good site would look like. We also wanted to document our work because we wanted to explain how we configured the servers. And of course, we want to lead by example. And our goal was to configure as many Internet Society websites as possible, because when we got into the test framework and we got the scores for our websites, we found there was room for improvement in many of them. Now, in order to create the reference servers, we found Apache and Nginx environments, and you have the links over here. You can use them to find those servers right over there. Now, for the process of documentation, we used GitHub. We started experimenting, if you will. We wanted to take that into account, and we actually developed the documentation on GitHub. It is published over there in that link that you see, and we did really well. We interacted with the community, which is something that we were after as part of the project as well. Dan has also shared the link for the GitHub repository over there in the chat box. So if you want to take a look at it, go ahead. Now, with regards to leading by example, our own websites showed that we needed to practice what we were preaching and promoting. So the first thing that we did was we audited all of our corporate sites. And these are the results that we got. And then we started working on implementing the changes. If anyone has any questions so far, please feel free to ask them, because that's what this is about. We want this to be an interactive session. So if you have questions or comments, use the chat box or the Q&A session. Go ahead and feel free. You can ask whatever you feel like. So now before we begin, we do need to provide a bit of context for you, because we worked focusing on 3 types of web servers. First, we were looking for those that were self-hosted on a server or virtual machine. In this case, you tend to have access to the command line and you can configure your files. Another kind of web server that we identified were those that were hosted with a website hosting provider. In that case, you do not have command line access. And what you typically do if you want to execute a particular change or carry out an update is you use web administration forms. So you are rather limited in what you can do. And you normally depend on the support provided by that hosting provider. And then we have those servers that connect to the content delivery networks or CDNs. And in that case, you can use a CDN in front of your self-hosted or hosted website. And you will realize what the difference is later on in the presentation. Now, with regards to website hosting providers, one of the main elements that distinguish them from others is that more often than not, you're very limited in what you can do. In that case, what we recommend is for you to contact your support team, the technical support team of the hosting provider, and you request the standard that you want to implement. You can use, of course, our OSE documentation in order to support your request, in order to show what is the standard that you want to implement in your web servers. And if you don't find any satisfactory answers, and if the support team cannot provide you with any support for your request, you can consider moving to other hosting providers. So that's something else that you can consider. Now, I was saying about the CDNs is that when there are no CDNs and when you are not using a CDN in your own connection, web browsers directly connect to your web server. And that's what it looks like over there. But on the contrary, when the connection is done through a CDN, the web server that originates that content connects to the CDN, and the browsers reach the CDN rather than directly connect to the web server. Now, some important aspects of these CDNs is that they can provide IPv6, HTTP2, TLS, DNSSEC, even in the cases where the original web server does not offer them. So that's a bonus for us if you do have an option of choosing a connection via CDN. Also, it is important noting that CDNs can dramatically improve the speed of your sites and even the protection of those sites from some attacks. As a matter of fact, we've come across examples where several websites rely on CDNs to protect themselves from attackers. So that's another factor that we can consider. Now, some of these CDNs offer free services. However, others require payment for some or for all their services. And of course, that's something for you to evaluate. You can check all the available options in the market and choose one if you're interested in that. Now, the list is very long. You have a lot of options. You have Akamai, Amazon CloudFront, Cloudflare. I think those are the ones that people know the most. But we also have Fastly, Google Cloud. We have Microsoft Azure. The list is very long. So if you're interested in perhaps using one of these services, what I would recommend is for you to make sure you check all of these options and see what they're offering, and especially to see which ones would affect and adapt the most to your servers. Now, there is a connection between CDNs and the domain name registry, because on the one hand, CDNs provide authorized DNS. As you can see over here, the DNS server of the CDN is established as a name server for your domain. That is an NS register. And another configuration could be a CNAME register to point towards the CDN. So you then have the control of those registers. In general terms, what I would say that they both work. The choice is yours, but do take into consideration that you have several available options in terms of configuration. Now, if anybody has any questions or any comments, I do remind you that you can ask any questions through the chat box or the Q&A. And now we will move towards the TLS. Now, the RFC that defines a version of TLS was published in August 2018. What Transport Layer Security does is encrypt the connection between the web browser and the web server. This was previously known as SSL, and the reason for this to matter is because encryption protects all the information that is flowing through that connection. If a third party intercepts that communication and in a way intercepts that data flow, the information that is there will not make any sense because it will be encrypted. Now, it is important for us to remember that servers only support 1.2 and 1.3 versions of the TLS. So in this case, if you want to implement that layer, you need to enable to enable TLS 1.0 and 1.1. Now, if TLS is active, you can install Let's Encrypt, and there the TLS certificates are free of charge. We do understand that a lot of the times the cost of adopting some of these servers might, sorry, not servers, services, might be problematic. So this is a good alternative. I am now actually working with my own website in order to install Let's Encrypt certificates because they're very much reliable. So that's an option for you if you don't want to use a CDN. Now, there are specific configurations for us to consider. There are, as I was mentioning, both for Apache and for Nginx. So whether they're self-hosted or hosted. In the case of the self-hosted servers that use Apache, the recommendation to configure this is to follow all of these instructions. Go to the directory where you install Let's Encrypt, then find this protocol line, and then configure it using these parameters that you find here. And then you save the file, you restart Apache, and then you will enable the support for TLS 1.2 and 1.3, and you remove the support for TLS 1.0 and 1.1, which are obsolete. Now, this entire description is contained in the link that you have over there at the bottom of the presentation. So if you want to check that, you can find that, but you can also find it in the links that you have in the chat box in the GitHub repository. So if you want to look at this more closely, you can. Now, in the case of self-hosted servers that are using Nginx, again, you go to the directory where you installed Let's Encrypt, you edit the configuration file, you find that same line, and then you carry out the configurations that you have to, and then you save the file, you restart Nginx, and then once again, you enable the support for TLS 1.2 and 1.3. Now, there are different versions of TLS depending on the CDN that you are using if this is not the case of a self-hosted server. For example, for Akamai, you just log into your Akamai account, you go to the CDN certificate section, and under actions, you can carry out these settings as is described over here in the list. Basically, what you need to do is you need to disable the specific TLS versions of 1.0 and 1.1, and then you complete with the complete the configuration. Now in Cloudflare, you log into your account, you go to the icon of SSL TLS, and then you click on Add Certificates. Then you have to scroll to the menu that has to do with the minimum TLS version. That minimum should be 1.2. And in that way, you can automatically enable 1.2 or higher, which is what we want. We want nothing below 1.2. Now, if you have any questions or comments about what we're talking about, I'm going to take a sip of my coffee if you think about any question, while you think about any questions. So let's move on to the cipher order of TLS, because TLS uses multiple cryptographic ciphers for encryption and for digital signatures. So the best practice here would be to configure your web server to prefer most secure ciphers at all times. As a matter of fact, we at Internet Society are focusing in one of our projects solely on encryption. If you want to hear more about that, just check out our website, internetsociety.org. And as a matter of fact, that was the first session of fundamentals, right? That was on encryption. So I'm sure that you've heard a lot about the importance of encrypting our communications. So bear that in mind. Now, in order to configure the cipher order in self-hosted servers using Apache, once again, you go to the directory where you installed Let's Encrypt, Then you edit the config file, you find that line and you set it to these parameters. Just after that, you save the file, you restart Apache, and then you will have your cipher order enabled. In the case of Nginx, the configuration is similar. You go to the directory where you installed Let's Encrypt, you edit the configuration file, you find this command line, and then you set it to these parameters. Now you save the file, you restart Nginx, and then once again, you have the best encryption options. Now, with regards to the use of CDNs and the cipher order, our research has shown so far that most CDNs do not allow for changing the cipher order unless you're paying a customer with a premium or enterprise plan, such as the case of Cloudflare. The documentation actually specifies how to do that. So what we recommend is for you to contact the support team and ask for this particular cipher order that we're describing. So what we're saying is just use the order that we suggest for Apache or Nginx. In the case of Akamai, there are several pre-configured suites of ciphers, so we recommend you check this link to get more information, bearing in mind that that particular link is in English though. So if you're using Akamai, you can check that over there. If you have questions, comments, before I move on. I don't see any questions in the chat box or in the Q&A, so you can keep going. Okay then. Let's move to HSTS. So the RFC here was defined in 2012 for HSTS. And the interesting thing is that after the first visit, this requires web browsers to only connect to your site via HTTPS. This can, of course, protect you against man-in-the-middle attacks. This typically is set for a 6-month period. And the note here, and what's important is if you disable TLS, the web browsers that have already visited your site will not be able to connect over insecure HTTP until HSTS has expired. So do consider that. That is, of course, part of making our internet activity more secure. And of course, not just us, but that of all the users who are visiting our websites. Now, if we want to configure this in web servers that are self-hosted in Apache, you edit your configuration file, which is usually httpd.conf or apache.conf, and you find the 443 section. You will see it like that, and then you add the HSTS header, then you save the file and you restart Apache. So the maximum age here, that part of the parameter over here, that corresponds to those 6 months, which is 31,536,000,000 seconds. So that's why that number corresponds to that, because those are the 6 months. So like I said, you save the file, you restart Apache, and you're ready to go. In the case of Nginx, the step is the same. You go to the configuration file, and then you find that line below. You establish those 6 months, you save the file, and you restart the server. Once again, the documentation is detailed in GitHub. You have all the links under that main link that Dan shared in the chat box. Now for the CDNs in Cloudflare, for example, you have to log into your Cloudflare dashboard. You have to go to the appropriate Cloudflare account for the domain requiring HSTS. You ensure the proper domain is selected. You then go to the Cloudflare SSL TLS app. Then you select Edge certificates. And then over here, you click Enable HSTS under the HTTP Strict Transport Security section. You will see a confirmation window. You have to review the warning content. You click on I understand, then you click on next, and then that's it. You configure the HSTS settings that are appropriate for your particular domain. And once again, the maximum age that is recommended is at least 6 months. Then you save your changes and you're ready to go. Do you have any questions, comments? You can write them in the chat box and the Q&A, but I see that there are none, so I think we can keep going. Now, for the HTTP security headers, what we've come to see as best practices is to include several HTTP headers to protect against common attacks. It is possible that out of the exercises that we are doing, we're showing simple configurations. So you may need to make changes for your own site. I mean, these are very general configurations. So what we recommend is for you to add headers one at a time and test them. So don't add them all in one go. For self-hosted servers using Apache, first you need to edit your configuration file. You find this code and then you find the IF module mod. And then immediately before the statement, you need to add that part. Then you find the 443 section and you add these security headers. Now, like I recommended, add them by one, save the file, restart Apache, and see how your website is behaving. So if you see any variations that you need to make, you can test them, and you can even share that with us to see what you've done. So by the end of the presentation, when we get to the initiatives, this could be a very useful thing for you to set up these configurations. And if you had to make changes for your own sites, you can actually include that in your own initiatives. Now for the security headers in servers that are self-hosted using Nginx, you can open that configuration file, and then you add the lines that you see below. But it is important that you must at least Nginx 1.3.7. Then you save the file and you restart the service. Now, with regards to the use of CDNs and security headers, the 4 security headers that we recommend adding will all pass through the CDN if they're configured at the origin server. There are some CDNs, though, that do allow for configuration of these headers if the origin server does not support them. So it would also be interesting to learn about your own experiences to know whether or not your servers fall under any of these cases. Do you have questions, comments? You can use the chat box or the Q&A box. But having said that, let's move to DNSSEC. In the case of DNSSEC, what we want is to provide a way to be sure you're getting accurate information from the domain name system. In our work in Internet Society Deploy 360, we produce a lot of information regarding DNSSEC. You can find it over here in this website, internetsociety.org. You go to /deploy360/DNSSEC. There's a lot of information there, many resources that you can check out. For example, the individual steps for DNSSEC signing with all the actors involved, such as the registry, the registrar, the DNS operator, and the domain name registrant. In your case, for example, you would have to enable the DNSSEC unless that enabling is done automatically. For example, for servers that are DNSSEC and are self-hosted in Apache and Nginx, what matters is for DNSSEC to be configured with your DNS servers. And the steps generally include these 3 elements. First, for the DNS servers that host your domain and must sign the domain, these servers might be the ones that you are operating directly. They might be at the DNS hosting provider, or they might be at your domain name registry. The second step has to do with the fact that information from the DNS servers about the signatures must be given to your domain name registrar. So that is what we know as the DS record. And then the domain name registrar will send that DS record to the registry from the top level domain for your domain, such as .com, .org, .nl, .mx. That depends on the domain that you're using. So once all of these steps have been completed, your domain will then be signed. In the case of CDNs, most of them require minimal changes for DNSSEC traffic to pass. And some CDNs can provide DNS hosting services and automatically sign with DNSSEC. That is why many times using a CDN is the speedy option to implement these standards, especially for people that might not have profound technical knowledge of the use of these standards, or for people who want to do this quickly. As I always tell you, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A box or the chat box. And then let's move to IPv6. This is a technology that has been around for a while now. And what we have seen here is that web servers need IPv6 connectivity. And for example, if you are unable to get an IPv6 address for any reason whatsoever, you might want to consider using a CDN. As part of the work we have carried out in Internet Society, there is a Deploy 360 called Making Content Available over IPv6. I do recommend you check that out because it's also important for content to be available through IPv6 and not just out of the adoption of users. Now, how can you know whether you're using IPv6? Well, you can open a command line window and you can write down that command. And one of two things can happen. First, you might have a unique IPv6 address, as you can see in these examples, or you can have a CDN name and multiple IPv6 addresses, or this would be what it would look like if you don't have IPv6 addresses, or you can have CDN names, but without IPv6 addresses. So it would be very evident if you have IPv6 or not. Now, in the case of self-hosted servers in Apache, Apache should be configured by default to listen to all interfaces. But that's something that you can confirm in your configuration file, which can usually be httpd.conf or apache.conf through this command. In the case of Nginx, you also open the configuration file and you add the second line below that you can see over there in bold. Then you save the file and you restart the service. In the case of CDNs, an advantage is that many CDNs support IPv6 by default. And we know that the ones that support IPv6 by default are Akamai, Amazon, CloudFront, Beluga CDN, Cloudflare, Fastly, Limelight, and OVH. But we could perhaps expand the list in the documentation. So if, for example, you realize that there are CDNs that already support IPv6 by default and they're not in this list, you can provide that feedback so we can update our own documentation and have a closer look and overview of those CDNs. Now, with regards to IPv6 and DNS, your web servers must have an AAA record in DNS, and also your DNS servers must have an AAA record in DNS to be reachable from IPv6 only networks. And that's what it looks like. Once again, if you have questions, make sure you ask. And now we move on to HTTP2. Now, the RFC that defines HTTP2 was published in May 2015, and basically what it does is it speeds web server performance and reduces latency because it allows for multiple exchanges of data on a single connection. It compresses headers and enables web servers to push data to web browsers. So it has a more efficient behavior. In order to carry out this configuration in self-hosted Apache servers using Debian, this is a list of steps. First of all, you need to stop Apache, and then you follow all these instructions. They are all described in the link that you see here at the bottom that is part of our documentation in the GitHub repository. Now, for servers that are self-hosted in Nginx, you open the configuration file, that usual nginx.conf. You add the text below that you see marked in bold. And in a case, again, you save the file and you restart the service and you're ready to go. In the case of CDNs, some of them, well, many of them actually support HTTP2 alt. in particular Akamai and Cloudflare actually enable it by default. But if you discover that there are other CDNs that support HTTP2 by default, you can include that as part of your initiatives as well. I will show you the options that we have for the project in a moment. So now let us move to the end. The first thing that we would like to know is how you did with your own website markers with the score you got in internet.nl or http2.pro. And what we want is that once you have carried out these configurations, your initial score will substantially improve. We have actually had multiple success stories in our community. The India chapter got a perfect score after implementing many of these changes last year. And so now comes that part that I mentioned several times throughout the presentation. It has to do with creating an initiative as a part of the ISAC Fundamentals project. What we are looking for is that once you have checked all of this documentation and you've gotten acquainted with all of the possibilities, for you to carry out one of these initiatives. You can check them later on in the link that you have over here. This one is specifically selected for open standards everywhere. But these are the 4 initiatives that we have for you. 3 of them are easy and one of them is difficult. One alternative for you who are part of this program is for you to write down and publish a blog or create a video on open standards and the security of web servers. That could be written material, that can be video material where you're describing this information that we're sharing and you're describing the information that is published in GitHub to spread it in your local community. Because I think that you, better than anyone, knows the needs of your local communities. So one efficient alternative could be for you to spread that message. Another possibility could be for you to improve your own web servers and carry out these improvements by using the documentation that we have on open standards and that we have published in our Internet Society and in our GitHub repositories. So there are many options here. If you have access to the command line, you can access the configurations that you have to. Mariana is saying that she can't hear me. I don't know if this is happening to everyone. Waldo says that he can hear me, so we're good. I think Dan also shared some information in the chat box regarding the Kolkata chapter. And actually, they had this original score, and then they got a perfect score by implementing these instructions that we have in our website. So that's another way for you to implement an initiative in this project. Another initiative is to promote the importance of open standards and the security of web servers. This could focus on youth, the civil society. You can talk to government, companies, members of the academia, journalists, in any way that you want. You can promote the importance of open standards everywhere among your local community. And another thing that you can do is carry out a training or a webinar on open standards and the security of web servers. Rally is saying that in the case of the Panama chapter, the score is 32% for their website. So there, for example, if you have access to the configurations of your chapter server, you can implement several of these technologies that we were describing. As you can see, several of them are relatively easy. Some of them take a bit more time, but in general, each implementation substantially improves the score your website gets at the end of the implementation. So I imagine 2 initiatives. On the one, you can improve compliance with these standards, but at the same time, you can document that improvement via a blog or via video. Someone else perhaps might actually provide a training to the chapter members. So while you are implementing the improvements, you can train other people and work on capacity building. And at the end of the process, you can publish an article where you describe the work that you've done. And that also is promotion. So these are the options that we have to carry out an initiative as part of ISAC fundamentals. And I want you to please take this into account, because that's what we need in order for you to get your certificate. Now, if you have any questions, if you want to implement something and you don't know how to do it, and you want to contact us directly, you can write to Dan York at isac.org, or you can write to me, Israel Rosas at isac.org, and I will call Dan and ask for his help, and then I will answer back, because he is our leader and our expert on the subject. We also want to ask you to spread the news, share the documentation on OSEs, join us on GitHub to improve the documentation that we have, because basically what we want is for open standards to be everywhere. And that, of course, includes our own websites and our own services. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, you can write them in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And if you don't have any questions that pop up right now, we are available via email to help you implement your initiatives. And I do hope that I get to share with you in the future how I did with my own websites and what are the improvements that I could carry out. What happened to me was that I was using a rather artisanal hosting service. And when I asked for them to install the Lansing script certificates, they were unable to do it. So I will surely change hosting provider, because I did not get real good attention and good help from the support team. So tell us what you come across. And if you come across any obstacles, please don't be disparaged. Write an email to us and we will help you, because it's very likely for other people to have gone through the same thing that you have gone through. So maybe we can share tips with you as to how they figured those things out. So don't be discouraged. Do your best. Try to improve your websites, and not because of the score that you get in internet.nl, but because every time you improve the services available in a web server, you're making internet more secure. And if internet is more secure for you, it is more secure for those people that are going into your websites, that are checking your services and checking your content. So we're making internet more secure at a global level. So remember, this is like a big neighborhood, and we need to be solidary, and we need to take care of each other and improve the security of the network that we live in and we inhabit every single day. I don't know if there are any comments or any questions. If not, Nancy, I want to thank you for your time. Once again, I want to congratulate you for this program. I think it's great to have ISAC fundamentals and work on them. It's great to have so many people from our chapters who are interested. And once again, thank you to Sun Limit for interpreting into English. Thank you for your excellent work. Thank you, Israel. There are no questions, but I do want to remind everyone that their initiative should be completed before June the 30th. And next week, we will keep on having sessions. We have a manners session, routing security session, and the internet way of networking session as well. That's for Thursday and Friday next week. So I do want to remind you that if you have enrolled, to join us next week. And well, we hope to hear from your initiatives and to know how you want to contribute to this mission that we have as members of an organization of having an internet for everyone. Good afternoon or night, everyone, and have a lovely day. Bye-bye.